Thank you. I will try to update communism with PowerPoint, so can we have the picture there? Can you say somebody to someone? Okay, now he's there, I see. Okay, thank you. So, now we are updating communism. Communism of truth, Kant avec Aristotle. First of all, I have to thank Badiou and Slavoj Žižek for the invitation to speak here today, and all those who have participated in making this event possible, including the audience. So forgive me if my voice is shaken. Namely, for me this event means the same as to take part in the same banquet with Plato and Aristotle themselves. No wonder my voice is shaken. But do not be mistaken. I'm not talking about fear. No, it is not fear. It is the ravishment of philosophy, the enjoyment of thinking together. In other words, it is the jouissance of communism of truth that I'm talking about. The reading of Aristotle and Kant I present today is, especially when it comes to Aristotle, very different from the standard readings we are so used to hear. However, my reading goes to the letter. It repeats a concept by concept what reads there literally in the sixth book of the Nicomachean and in Kant's Critique of Judgment. As you will hear, with these readings I will demonstrate aesthetics as first philosophy and the communism of truth as the primordial way of sharing the truth. All the other ways of dealing with the truth and all the other ways of understanding the concept of communism are logically secondary. My theses are: 1. Beyond the standard readings of philosophical classics, there prevail structures of articulations that rely on what I call the communism of truth. 2. Within the communism of truth, truth processes rely on experiences of truth, on sensus communis that traverses common senses. 3. This kind of sensus communis is without a concept. In other words, it is primordial in regard to the concepts. 4. Thus, beyond the standard readings of philosophy and within the communism of truth, aesthetics is first philosophy. 5. This kind of communism of truth is, by definition, in the ongoing debate and disagreement with all the concrete politics of its time, for the sensus communis of communism of truth cannot be reduced to, limited to, or harmonized with common senses. 6. The difference between the sensus communis and common senses defines the abyss between philosophy and politics. And 7. It is the most profound hamartia to miss this abyss. So I will use 15 minutes for this introduction and for Aristotle. Then I will take about 10 minutes about Kant, and then about 15 minutes about aesthetics as first philosophy and the enjoyment of truth. And last I have 5 minutes for the epilogue with the title, My Comrades in Truth. So now I will go to the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6. In the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, Aristotle divides psyche in two parts, one with logos and the other without. He does not specify what he means by the part without logos, but the plausible reference point is the discussion in the Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, in which psyche without logos is divided into two: the vegetative part and the part that opposes and runs counter logos. Now, when humankind is on the edge of ecological catastrophe, the analysis of this and its historical heritage would certainly be worth of trying. However, because of the lack of time, I have to step over it, even if I may refer to it briefly below. Namely, the next division handles the part of psyche with logos. The first part contemplates those things whose archai cannot be otherwise, and another those things whose archai can be otherwise. The part dealing with things whose archai cannot be otherwise, Aristotle calls epistemenikon, and the part dealing with things whose archai can be otherwise is called logistikon. On the side of epistemenikon, theoretical thinking takes place, and the side of logistikon we find practical thinking. Epistemenikon and logistikon are related to nous, and their characteristic ergon, function, is aletheia, truth. There are 5 ways of aletheuein, of truth taking place. 1, episteme, 2, sophia, 3, tekne, 4, phronesis, and 5, nous. 1. Of these, episteme is characterized by beings that cannot be otherwise, that do not come into being or cease to be, that are didacte, teachable, and matheton, something one can learn. 2. Sophia is defined as episteme with nous by Aristotle. Sophia deals with beings whose archai cannot be otherwise. As such, Sophia is timiotatehe, the worthiest, the most honorable. 3. Tekne is the same as poietic disposition with aletheia giving logos. It is to do with coming into being, perigenesis, and it is concerned with beings that are or come into being by necessity. In other words, it is concerned with what can be otherwise. 4. Phronesis. Phronesis is metaluku, with logos, and it is concerned with things that are good or bad for human beings. It deals with things that are achievable in action, with hekasta, particulars, that come to be known through empiria, which takes a long time. The difference between tekne and phronesis is that tekne is related to poiesis, whereas phronesis is related to praxis. The difference in regard to episteme and sophia is that those deal with beings that are always as they are, whereas phronesis concerns beings that are achievable in action and that thus can be otherwise, as does tekne. What is common both for sophia and phronesis is that they are worthy of choice in themselves, even if they do not produce anything. 5. Last, as the 5th way of aletheian, as the 5th way in which the truth can take a place, and as the kernel of my argument comes nous. Here Aristotle is explicit. Our ways of aletheian, that is, neither episteme, sophia, tekne, or phronesis, cannot provide archai. So it remains for nous to be in touch with archai. Thus the relationship of psyche to archai is called nous. According to some editions of the Nicomachoenetics, nous is both arche and telos. Then there comes the dynamite. Aristotle differentiates between 2 kinds of aesthesis, the one that is peculiar for phronesis and another beyond which one cannot go, and which is nous. It is this nous that Aristotle calls in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics the highest element in us. Nous is concerned with horon, limits, for which there is no logos. Thus nous is aneu loku, without logos. In other words, in the kernel of aleuteuein, within logos, in the heart of truth processes, takes place the event of nous, which is without logos. Because of this ultimate characterization as taking place without logos, nous is connected to another term, namely to eupoulia and the corresponding verb pouleusasthai. It is worth of noting that they both function on the side of epistemenikon and on the side of logistikon. They have to function on the both sides of this fundamental ontological division, for they are the only connection of psyche to archai. And if they would not function on both sides, some beings within psyche would not have any connection to archai. In fact, they are the only connection within psyche between the beings whose archai cannot be otherwise and the beings whose archai can be otherwise. Without nous, every psyche would be divided into two without any connection between the two parts. The difference between eupoulia and nous is clear. Nous is without logos, whereas pouleusasthai does not take place without logos. In other words, eupoulia names exactly the process within which nous is translated and transformed into the space of logos. The error in pouleusasthai is called hamartia. In Badiou's terms, we can say that eupoulia means the process within which the evental statement is introduced and presented for the event of nous. Thus, the articulation of the sixth book of the Nicomachean Ethics looks like this. So we have on the left side those things whose archai cannot be otherwise, and aletheia, the truth that is connected to those beings, is connected or takes place in Sophia and episteme. And then we have those things whose archai can be otherwise, and truth that concerns them takes place in phronesis and techne. But what is important is that all connection to the archai goes through the nous, which is between them or on the both sides, and which is aneu loku, without logos, and which needs eupoulia as a process in which archai are translated into the logos. Finally, we can connect this all to the well-known basic facts of Aristotle's politics, namely to the fact that it is logos that distributes human beings into the Greeks and barbarians. For the highest element in us that grants us the truth does not depend on logos. In the end, logos is secondary in regard to the aesthesis of nous. Whatever is said in Aristotle's politics is secondary in regard to his ethics founded on nous. Similarly, we can note almost in a deconstructive fashion that what was foreclosed before this fundamental ontological division between epistemenikon and logistikon, namely the part of psyche which is without logos, is introduced again as the kernel of the psyche with logos. Here one has to remember that all the animals and even plants have psyche in Aristotle's articulation. Without going to any New Age readings of classics of philosophy, here Aristotle is not so far, for example, from Spinoza. And this opens up huge questions concerning nous. As another kind of aesthesis, nous without logos functions as the spring of truth. So is it not the encounter between the animal we are and logos that results in truth? From this perspective, ecological catastrophe names the truth of our times. Okay, next I will go to the Kant. Now I will leave to Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment. Because of the lack of space and time, I will just draw down the basic constellation of Kant's articulation, which is probably much better known than Aristotle's articulation. Before that, just a brief note on what the stakes are here. Compared to Kant's first and second critiques, in the third critique, it is not a question of a separate area of philosophy, let us say of aesthetics and of the philosophy of theology, as university people would like to read Kant so often. No, the question is much more fundamental. Namely, the problem is how we can do any kind of judgments, both within knowledge and within ethics. The first and the second critics could not answer this question. In them, Kant was not able to articulate how to connect the universal foundation of knowledge and ethics to each singular situation. In other words, in the third critique, it is the burden of the relationship between universal and singular that Kant is confronting with. That relationship is the ultimate question here, not the question of the taste or of the finality of nature. The question of the taste and of the finality of nature are only mediums for proposing and formulating the problem of judgment in general. That is, the problem of the relationship without relation between universal and singular. As will be seen, Kant repeats the basic division of Aristotle's articulation with certain changes. So we have, on the one side, the concepts of nature, and on the other side, the concept of freedom. On the side of the concepts of nature, we have understanding, and on the side of the concept of freedom, we have reason. So on the side of the concepts of nature, we have understanding, and on the side of the concept of freedom, we have reason. Of these, understanding and reason are constitutive a priori. This division is followed by the division within philosophy. On the side of understanding, we find theoretical philosophy, and on the side of reason, we find practical philosophy. Again, we have two realms that do not have any connection without the third position beyond this grounding division. The faculty of judgment may be assumed to effect the transition from understanding to reason. In other words, between the faculty of knowledge and the faculty of desire, there functions the faculty of judgment, which, however, does not have its own realm, as do the two other faculties. Namely, the faculty of knowledge has its concept of nature, and the faculty of desire has its concept of freedom, but the faculty of judgment is by definition ohne Begriffe, without concept. Thus, again, we have a middle term without any own place within the ontological order of being, a term on which all truth processes are dependent on. What is more is the fact that this middle term can be characterized as aesthetic. Its effects are the feelings of beauty and sublime, but not as some kind of sense for art. In fact, Kant does not mention a single work of art, only a pyramid, but as our touch to das Ding, the thing in itself. So, as far as truths and ethics have anything to do with the thing in itself, they are depending on the faculty of judgment ohne Begriffe. Our understanding and reason would be totally in vain without this touch of das Ding. Here lies the fundamental meaning of Kant's sensus communism. It is the community of those who share the judgment without concepts, who hold on to that judgment beyond all common senses. It is not a community of hypocritical art critics, far from it. It may be a scientific community working on the same mysteries of nature. It may be an artistic movement like that of Monet, Cézanne, et al. It may be the community of people working for justice in some part of this unjust world. It may be a community of lovers holding for their love. Or it may be a community of philosophers wondering about communism at midsummer in Berlin. The only thing common to them is the nous aneolokou, the judgment without concept, and it is this kind of communism that is prior to all other forms of communism. In other words, the communism of truth can be found in the fundamental articulation of Aristotle and Kant. The names connected to what certain want to be philosophers in quotation marks would call, again in quotation marks, scientific or rational philosophy, differentiated from existential philosophers like Nietzsche or Kierkegaard, or from Marxists like Marx himself. Against such empty mirror readings, I claim that these kinds of standard readings of Aristotle and Kant tell more about university discourse than about Aristotle and Kant, about what Aristotle and Kant articulated. Both Aristotle and Kant articulate how one can participate in truth. This participation is the relationship without relation between universal and singular. The term relationship without relation names here what Aristotle calls nous without logos and Kant calls judgment ohne Begriffe. Thus, it is very easy for me to cite Alain Badiou here. Quote, "That's because in every great philosopher there is the theme of the direct participation of singularity in universality, without the deter via particularities, cultures, nationalities, gender differences, and so forth. In every great philosopher there is a direct link between the singularity of thought and its universality." End of quote. It is this participation in truth beyond particular concepts, this nous aneolokou, this sensus communis of judgment ohne Begriffe, that communism of truth is all about. It is this kind of communism of truth that every realization of communism, if there is or has ever been or will ever be in such a thing, relies on. This communism of truth relies on its part on aesthetics as first philosophy. So I will deal with aesthetics as first philosophy next. The sentence aesthetics is first philosophy functions at least on two levels. One, its historical roots imply, of course, references both to what became to be called metaphysics after Aristotle's corpus was established, and what Aristotle himself called first philosophy, and to Levinas ethics as first philosophy. As such, this sentence as if closes the circle. What university discourses call metaphysics or ontology or ethics and aesthetics cannot be separated from each other, as the representatives of so-called analytic philosophy pretend to do. The articulations of metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics determine each other. 2. The fact that Aristotle's nous is aneolokou and Kant's judgment is ohne Begriffe opens up the possibility for philosophy. In other words, if nous had logos and judgment had concept, there would not be any space for philosophy. If nous had logos, sciences, arts, politics, and love would be transparent for themselves without any need or room or call for philosophical intervention. What is more, even if one would continue to do this vain philosophy just for its own cause, if nous had logos, both metaphysics and ethics would both be first philosophy separately, independently from each other. But because nous has no logos, aesthetics is first philosophy, and metaphysics and ethics are always built on aesthetics and tied together by their common foundation in aesthetics. This gives the ultimate meaning to Kant's analysis of the sublime as the analysis of the position of a philosopher in regard to the thing and to judgments in general. Again, this gives the more radical sense to the sentence aesthetics is first philosophy. Namely, all truth processes expect this other kind of aesthesis, this nous aneuloku, this judgment of nebegriffe. Aesthetics as first philosophy refers to this non-transparent nucleus of all thought, which is in the end the origin of not only of all truths, but philosophy, sciences, arts, politics and love altogether. In this sense, aesthetics as first philosophy forms the only way the communism of truth can insist its becoming. Philosophy can have any general meaning and weight only if aesthetics is first philosophy. This is because aesthetics forms the groundless ground not only for philosophy, but for all discourses concerned with truth. Thus, for example, Levinas ethics expects the experience of the face of the other, of the event of the interpellation of the other through the face. Similarly, Badiou's ethics of truth is built on the experience of the event. If there is no experience of the event, there is absolutely no truth at all. These experiences of the face of the other and of the event are contemporary translations of Aristotle's nous. All of them are beyond words, but requiring one to continue them with words, that is, calling for eupoulia. It is this process from nous to eupoulia that aesthetics is all about, and as such it forms the very kernel of philosophy. Sciences, arts, politics and love are not so interested in what it means to translate the experience into words. They just do it. It is philosophy's task to tackle this problem, and this problem first of all. In other words, philosophy begins with aesthetics that studies the experiences on which truths are built. This is what Plato's dialogues are all about. This is what Descartes throws out in his discourse on the method. This is the starting point for Kant, etc. Let me now draw out some consequences of aesthetics as first philosophy. Namely, it has to be understood that truth is always structured and made up in a singular aesthetic situation. For example, every scientific project has its own aesthetic environment formed by infrastructure, the history of that science, the development of technology, and the very way of functioning of that project itself. This kind of aesthetic environment is not transparent. Thus, what comes out of it can be understood and appreciated properly only from the point of view of that aesthetic environment. This explains why philosophy is secondary in regard to the truth processes in sciences, arts, etc. It is because the aesthetic environment is by definition singular. In Rancière's terms, it is only within a certain historical distribution of the sensible that the truth of that sensible can be acknowledged. One can do judgments of the sensible only by taking part in the distribution of that sensible. For a philosopher, this burdens as a double task. In order to do philosophy nowadays, a philosopher cannot settle down in one discourse. In order to be a philosopher, one cannot be a philosopher. Instead, one has to participate at least in two different aesthetic environments, in two totally different discourses. The discourse of philosophy and the discourse which produces primordial truths, be it a discourse of science, art, politics, clinic, or whatsoever. In such a double situation, among philosophers, a philosopher is never only a philosopher, but something else too. And among people of the other discourse, she is never only one of them, but the discourse of philosophy is haunting her uncannily. Only such a tension can give rise to a truth about truth. A truth about truth needs at least two discursive legs in order to stand tall and walk straight. Then as the last main chapter I have, chapter with title Enjoyment of Truth. Let us now return to the ravishment of thinking that I was referring to in the beginning of this paper. What kind of enjoyment could be connected to the truth? In fact, it is here that we see why Lacan took Kant as his starting point in his Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Lacan is explicit here. In these matters, no one has gone further than Kant, and that is why Kant is the starting point. So, where are we? Where did Kant end his project? As I mentioned, Kant's fundamental problem in the third critique was how we can make judgments about universals in singular situations. In fact, this is the parallel problem as the one known as the third man problem, articulated by Plato. In order to answer this problem, Kant introduces the feelings of beauty and sublime. What interests me here is what is connected to these feelings, namely pleasure, or as we should call it after Lacan, enjoyment. Let us take as an example an ethical judgment. Ethical judgment is founded on itself. You do ethical judgments because of themselves. So the enjoyment is not a reason to do ethical judgments. However, when we are asking in a singular situation whether my judgment is ethical, in other words, does it follow the universal reason and its concept, namely the categorical imperative, this question in a singular situation is ohne Begriffe. For if it had the concept, it would need another concept to connect this concept to the categorical imperative and so on ad infinitum. In other words, there cannot be any concept to determine whether the judgment follows the universal concept, and this is why Kant needs the faculty of judgment, ohne Begriffe. It is in this abuse between singular and universal that we find the enjoyment of truth. It is this abuse that opens up in front of Antigone, due to hamartia, the error of Eubulia by Creon, and it is this abuse that opens up Lacan's Ethics of Psychoanalysis. This abuse is found between the real of a body and the chain of signifiers, and it is from this abuse that jouissance erupts. In other words, the only sense that sensus communis has of the truth is the enjoyment, similar to that of the feelings of beauty and sublime. This means that if you do not enjoy, you do not follow the truth. This kind of enjoyment is the effect of truth. It is the addiction for the enjoyment of truth that explains the fidelity to truth. As a sensus communis, we are addicted. This is why, for Aristotle, to follow nous was the best thing to do. There is no enjoyment like the enjoyment of truth. Let me be precise. The effect of signifiers is meaning, but the effect of truth is enjoyment. One needs signifiers in order to articulate a truth, but this may present true meanings. But truth as the relationship without relation between universal and singular enjoys. There is no other way to be true. Thus, from this perspective, the task of aesthetics is also to analyze our enjoyment of truth. And this is what, for example, Kant's analysis of the feelings of beautiful and sublime do. So now I will end with the title, My Comrades in Truth. As I already referred to, the classical example, a kind of prototype of hamartia, is Creon's judgment in Sophocles' Antigone. But similar cases can be found also among the classics of philosophy, from Plato to Heidegger. To confuse the real of philosophy with the real of politics is always the most profound error, the fundamental blindness in regard to the differences between discourses. But my friends in thought, my comrades in the communism of truth, tragedy and comedy are not the only coordinates for the co-presence of philosophy and politics. A philosopher does not have to be a fool or a clown in order to commit herself to politics. No, the simple thing is to become not a philosopher king or a state philosopher, but a philosopher and a politician. In other words, to accept the incommensurability of these two commitments. The political activity I'm referring to does not necessarily have to be party politics. In fact, in the communism of truth, the only acceptable party may be a party without party, a party that would not cease to be only in the utopist end of its aims, as the socialism of the Soviet Union did, but it would cease to be ceaselessly. In other words, the party within the communism of truth would be nearer to Bataille than Lenin. And I'm also referring to Maurice Blanchot's book on Bataille and Duras, as was done yesterday too. So maybe you should read that book. Bataille, Georges Bataille. As with love, sciences, arts, and psychoanalysis, the real of these eventual discourses is to be found within them. The fact that their real is exactly that in the Lacanian sense, in other words, that their nous is without logos, and their judgment is ohne Begriffe, opens the space for philosophical events. Events whose eventual statement can often be crystallized in the names of the classics, Aristotle, Kant, Badiou, Žižek, Negri, etc. So what Lacan, Badiou, and Žižek name as the real names the fact that nous is without logos and judgment is ohne Begriffe. The fact that there are sciences, arts, politics, and loves testifies that this real can be talked about. The fact that there is generally significant philosophy testifies that this real remains as real in the Lacanian sense. The fact that arts, sciences, politics, and loves change all the time testifies of the same. The real can be talked about, but it is never transparent. It is to these eventual statements of philosophy, namely to the names like Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Badiou, Žižek, etc., that we, the friends of wisdom, have to commit ourselves. Our fidelity to philosophy is dependent on our ability to read and to reread the events of philosophy, and through these ongoing readings form the sensus communis of philosophy beyond common senses. In this way, we are the community of those who do not have common sense. Instead, we enjoy of truth. Thank you.